afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Francis and Stephanie and Felicia, for asking me to help share and celebrate the life of Dennis today. I'm going to start with the early years of Dennis, and I'm going to read you a little bit about those early years. Dennis was born in Marshalltown, Iowa on March 8, 1943, to Forrest and Frida Hixson. He lived there until his family relocated to Phoenix. While in Phoenix, he graduated from high school and attended Arizona State University. In 1965, at 22 years old, he was drafted into the Army, and he was selected to attend the Field Artillery Officer Candidate School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. In 1974, Dennis left the Army at the rank of captain and moved to Lawton, Oklahoma. Using his GI Bill educational benefits, he went back to work on his college education and graduated in 1975 from Cameron University with a Bachelor of Science degree. He then obtained his real estate license in 1978. He practiced real estate and also taught real estate courses for the next 15 years. And now is when we get to the good part. When Dennis met Francis. Their courtship started through the mail, not through email, but through an actual written letter back and forth to each other with a stamp. And Francis has talked about those letters. They were very touching. They were heartfelt. She could tell he was super charming. He was very smart. He was witty. And she really thought, could it get any better? Well, it did, because they met in person. And when they met in person, she said he was so cute, and he looked just like Jack Nicholson. So that sealed the deal. That was it. They had a lot in common, and so at that point, in 1994, after a fairly brief courtship, they got married in Providence, Rhode Island. And Dennis moved out here to Francis's ranch. We lovingly call it the Franch. And they began to share their love of horses and all things, horse events, horse shows, going on trail rides. And one of Francis's fond memories is taking Dennis on one of the first trail rides. Now, if you don't know this, Francis is a professional endurance rider. And what that means is she would go to these NATRAC competitions on the weekends and ride 50 miles of challenging courses with obstacles and be judged. And she actually rode 9,500 miles in competition. It's a lot. Dennis, on the other hand, was a novice rider. So she takes him off to the first trail ride, and they get, she laughs when she tells the story, so it makes me laugh. They get there, and it's dusk, but I think Dennis thought they were gonna go to bed and get up and ride out the next morning, but she was too excited. So they get on the trail, they get to the top, and it's pitch black. So at that point, I think Dennis is thinking, here I am with my professional horse woman wife, and here I am not really knowing what I'm doing, but he persevered, and when she tells the story, this is the part where she's laughing, so I can only imagine that Dennis's life was passing before his eyes as he made it down that trail. But he made it, and one of the things you may know about Dennis is he was invincible. He was a tough guy. So thankfully he made it, and I have a lot of stories about him being invincible and a tough guy that I'll share with you in just a minute. First, I want to talk about how this arena and this boarding business came to be. So Francis was working at the time it was Plano General, and she worked in the lab, and she worked with this nurse that was moving from one state to another, and the nurse had some Arabian horses. So she asked Francis if if she would mind boarding her 4 Arabians for, temporarily. And Frances and Dennis agreed, and kind of the rest is history, because Dennis was an entrepreneur at heart. And so he thought, what a great time and a great place to marry our passion of horses and a business and create a boarding business out here. So he put plans together to build this arena, to build some great turnouts, some stalls, trails in the back, hay fields, and he did it. He had some help, and he actually built this arena. And thankfully, that's really what's brought most of us here together today, is this beautiful horse ranch and Dennis's vision. Now, Dennis thought at this time this would be a great time to help Frances and he build a legacy out here. And with Frances's love of the Arabian horse, he decided that he was going to search for a beautiful black stallion, Arabian. And so he searched and searched, and he found one in Oregon. So in 1999, AV Olympic Spirit came to their ranch. And now, they took him to training. He went to, was at Lexington, Kentucky, and he became a top 10 cow working horse. But he was really out here to fulfill a duty, and that was to have some offspring. And that he did. He had Freedom, that's Frances's personal horse that she rides. He had Blaze that Stephanie rides. He had Flame and Honey Boo that Carla, she's out there, Carla owns. There she is. Carla owns them, they're beautiful. He had Chanel that Stephanie owns, and he also had Patriot. And by the way, if you haven't seen Spirit or met Spirit, he's at the small barn, and he's a senior now, but he's still sexy and he knows it. And so if you get a chance, go by there, because he struts his stuff. His theme song, we always joke, is "I'm sexy and I know it," and he still does that. Dennis also had a love of cows, and so through the years they've had a few cows up to 50, but he really liked all things with cow events. So he loved penning, he loved sorting, and he started out with penning, then he kind of moved to sorting, and if you ever come to one of those events, it's become one of the most popular events, thanks to Stephanie out here. It's a great event. They usually do those every other weekends when they've got the cow. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the personal side of Dennis. He was many things to many people. Not only was he the founder of Nelson Hixson, but he was a wonderful husband. He was a stepfather, he was a grandfather, and he was a friend to many. But before that, remember earlier I talked about he was invincible. Well, many of you know a lot of these stories, and we joke that Dennis literally had 30 lives. He was a tough guy, and so we've selected 5 or 6 stories to tell you. You probably know, you probably all have been parts of some of these stories. But I've named them. And so the first one is called, I need my glasses, Trail Ride Gone Wrong. I mean, there were probably a lot of those, but this is the one we picked. So on this day, Dennis dressed up, and he had a white button-down shirt on, and he decided to go out on the trail with a couple of boarders, and Stephanie was with them. And so they get out in the back, and if you've been out on the trails back there, there are a lot of trees. And so Dennis, somehow, he's riding Freedom, somehow he is impaled. It's not funny. He was, a large sharp branch entered his arm and went all the way up, basically to his shoulder. But I think his military training just kicked in, because he somehow got that branch out and decided he needed a tourniquet. He was bleeding. So Stephanie helped him. They made a tourniquet around his arm, and for those of us that were here that got to see them riding back, he was shirtless, he was bloodied, he was okay, and we call that, what do we call that? We call that life number 4. The next one is Big Dick. Back it up, sorry. This one's called Big Ditch, Little Truck. Say that 10 times, that's hard. So Francis had a very favorite truck, and it was this little white Ford sports track truck. It was fully loaded, and it had, I guess, I remember it. It had decals, and really, she loved the truck. And Dennis decides one day he's going to borrow it. And so he goes to McKinney, and he's riding back. And we don't know what happened. All we know is we think he hit a curb. We know he ended up in a ditch, and it was a big ditch. And we know that potentially he got knocked out, because all we know is that he was bloody. The truck was totaled. The truck was totaled, and he was gone forever. And so Francis was worried, but somehow he, again, kind of got back on the horse, got back in the truck, got it out of the ditch, drove back up, and I think Francis was waiting for him when he got here. Three flat tires, rolled the window down and said, "I'm home." So we call that life number 12. The next one, I was actually there. It didn't happen here at the French. It was called Tidal Wave Man Down. This story took place in Clearwater, Florida. Now, it was a really windy day, and the waves were crashing. It was really not safe to go in the water. There was no one out there. There were no lifeguards out there. And there was a group of us. It was Stephanie and Francis, Felicia, Francis's brother Alan, their cousin Kristen, and we decided if we formed a chain, we could actually make it out to where the tide had, out beyond the waves, so we could get out there in the calm water. So we did, and we were having a nice, relaxing time out there, and we look up on the shore, and there's Dennis, and he decides he's going to come out with us. Well, you can only imagine that the first wave knocked him down. He got up. Second wave, he gets up. Third wave. I think it happened 4 or 5 times, and finally he was just rolling. So it was like a scene out of Baywatch at that point, because Stephanie then body surfs up to where Dennis is and saved him. And so that was quite the day. That was life number 12. That was life number 15, pardon me. This one is called Double Trouble on Super Bowl night. Now, if you have been out here much, you probably know that there is something always going on. And sometimes it's tragic. And so one night, it was a Super Bowl night years ago, Stephanie gets a call from Beverly, the neighbor. Are you here, Beverly? I thought I saw you. Oh, there you are. So Beverly sees this guy crash through the field in the front, the pasture. And I think he was doing donuts or something. And it was a drunk driver. So Stephanie races out to the pasture, and they get the guy. I don't know. He went off. But Stephanie's in the cop car, and while they're taking a report in the cop car, the dispatch comes on the radio and says, there is an emergency at FM Road, 6064 FM Road 1377. And Stephanie goes, "That's my house, that's here." And they said, "Man having a heart attack." So, Dennis did. He had a heart attack that night. And this is not a roast of Dennis, because he would love these stories. He was okay. It was just one more of his tough guy, invincible stories. And that was life number 21. Okay, I only have 2 more of these, but we call it Dennis and the SS Minnow. So Dennis really loved to fish, and he'd been wanting a boat for a really long time. And so he finally went to Cabela's and he bought a paddle boat. So he takes it out to the front pond and to get his pickup out there, and he's in the middle of the pond. And while he's out there, Stephanie notices, he didn't take his cell phone, he didn't have any sunscreen, and he didn't take any water with him, and it's in July, it's about 105 degrees that day. So he gets out to the middle of the boat, to the middle of the pond, he's fishing. And Stephanie kept looking out, and every hour or so, she's looking at him. And finally, she said, I think I need to probably go check on him. Well, thank God she did. He was sunburned, he was dehydrated, and he was stuck to the middle of the pond. Something had happened, the moss had gotten up and gotten stuck on the paddles. But thankfully, Stephanie came up, got an old ski rope, and actually roped him in, brought him into the shore. Again, Dennis was okay. That was life number 21. And this is the last one. I saved it for the last, it's out of order, but it's the famous story. And one night, if you may have happened to see this on the ABC Nightly News one night. So it was, not sure who all remembers this, but it was during when there was a really bad drought out here. Texas was having a big drought. And so their hay fields, they had gone through all the hay and there was no hay to be found anywhere. So Dennis finally found some in Little Rock, or near Little Rock. So they hitched up the trailer, they headed off to Little Rock. They get a load full of really dry hay and they're pulling it back. And they're driving along the road with Penelope was in the car, which is Francis's at the time, little Jack Russell. And they start smelling smoke. And they don't see smoke, they don't see a fire anywhere, so they keep driving, but the smoke smell is getting more intense and more intense. And finally, that cabin of the truck starts heating up. And it starts getting hot enough where they need to pull over. And they get Penelope out of the car, and they look, and the whole trailer was engulfed in flames. So needless to say, the ambulance, the fire truck came, they were okay, thankfully, but the TV choppers got there, and that did make the nightly news. So enough about Dennis the Invincible. He was also a very good friend. On Sunday nights when we get the horses in and get them fed, we oftentimes go inside and eat. And when you walk in the door, anytime you were greeted by Dennis, it didn't matter your gender. If you were a group of women, he would say, "Hello, men." And if you were 5 or 60, if he liked you, he'd say, "Hey, kid." So we were always greeted like that. But we would sit down and have dinner, and Dennis would always tell lots of stories. And some of his favorite stories to tell were about being in Vietnam, and he did see a lot of combat. I got the sense that he didn't really like, the war part of it, but he led a squadron of men. He was a captain, and he got really close to the men, and he became a friend and a mentor to those friends, to those boys, really. And he was actually kind of a therapist to those guys. We also learned at those dinners what Dennis liked to eat. He didn't like anything green. He really only wanted to eat stuff if it had meat in it, unless it was Ruffles or chocolate chip cookies or Snickers, and he loved Cokes. And you're actually going to get to share some of Dennis's favorite snacks with us when we adjourn here today. Dennis loved dogs, and so Monica and Christian are here, and they breed American Bullies, and they used to bring some of their bullies out to visit. And that's when Dennis fell in love with that breed. And so he decided that he wanted his own. And that's Gypsy down there. That was Dennis's dog. And he loved to go to the dog shows and watch Monica show his dog. He's got her ribbons are hanging proudly in his office. Now Matilda's didn't make it out here. She's Francis's Jack Russell. And there's a reason. She's a very willful dog. And I think Dennis had a love-hate relationship with Matilda. Every night he'd go to bed and she would sit on his head. Her perch in the house is on the kitchen table. So even though Dennis, in his very gruffest voice, would say, "Matilda, get down, get off the table," to this day, she's probably sitting in there on the table right now. She's the dog that actually they had a trainer at one point, and she flunked out of obedience school. So they have a plaque in her honor that does say, my dog flunked out. But she's sweet. Dennis was a loving grandfather. He loved to go to sports events and academic events and scout events for the boys. One of some of Phoenix's favorite times were to come out here and spend the night and get up and make chocolate chip cookies and pancakes with Dennis in the morning. Fletcher liked to sit in his office and hear stories about the war, and they would talk a lot about history. It was in the war when Dennis lost a good amount of his hearing, and so that sort of became a source of humor for the boys. One story that Phoenix really likes is, so Felicia and the boys were sitting at the kitchen table, and Dennis and Francis were in the kitchen, and that's not 10 feet. That's a close proximity. And Dennis, thinking he's whispering, says to Francis, "Do you think Felicia knows that Fletcher's gone through the puberty?" You're welcome, Fletcher. Your mother gave me that story. Dennis was also a stepfather, and he was really kind of a mentor of sorts for Stephanie. They made a good team. They clashed heads sometimes, but they operated a great business. And they made sure that the animals were safe and healthy. They made sure that the boarders are happy. They made sure the property and the hay fields and all were taken care of. I think Dennis had a soft spot for Felicia. You could always hear them joking around together. And she really tried her best to keep him off Fox News and on to watching her cooking shows. That never happened. But she'd come out and cook for them, and she always obliged Dennis with making his favorite. He usually requested mac and cheese with Wolf Brand chili on top. Interesting palate. Dennis was a loving and wonderful husband. And Francis has said that Dennis was the love of her life, and he said that she was the love of his. They really did make a great pair, complementing each other in many ways. And I think that y'all were lucky to have found each other in the last 30 years. Dennis's other loves were, he loved to ride his tractor and his pickup around the land. He loved to play cribbage with friends. He loved to play solitaire on the computer. He actually, I didn't mention this, he worked for 17 years at Southwest Securities in IT and retired 5 years ago or so. He loved the Dallas Cowboys, so if it was on the weekend during football season, you could find him watching the Cowboys. He also loved to watch Dirk and Luca and the Mavs play during the week. Dennis truly did have a life well lived, and I think probably the last 30 years were among his best. He was very lucky. He got to live out his dream out here on a beautiful horse ranch surrounded by horses and cows and dogs and the love of his life, Francis. All right, well, that's the end of what I have to say, but if there's anyone else that has a story that you would like to share, Sharon, I think you're going to come up.